welcome to Another Education is Possible, a podcast about education's radical potential. This is Jordan.
And I'm Hermione.
Back when I taught this course, Education, Genocide, Liberation, on which the second season is based, Ermioni, you were a student in the class. For your final project, created an amazing podcast episode that had nothing to do with any other podcast. It was just a single episode about social movements, which I should also say you started in February of 2024 and finished during the first weeks of the encampments, which was a really powerful thing to encounter. But when we turned the class into a podcast, I invited former students back and said, if you would like to produce an episode, you'd be most welcome. And you were one of the students who responded and had a great idea for an episode. Can you tell us a little bit about what that episode is?
Yes, in this episode, we have Dr. Mark Leier as a guest. He is a professor of history at Simon Fraser University, which is where I'm doing my PhD right now, located in British Columbia, in Vancouver, and Burnaby. He is a professor here for the past many years. So he has a lot of experience on education and different educational methods and pedagogy. His research interests specifically include the history of the left, the history of anarchism, labor, contemporary issues in Canada, and beyond. And as he describes, in how the struggle between classes shapes history in general.
Awesome. So should we listen in to but mostly your interview with Dr. Mark Leier?
Yes. We'll talk about his book, which is called Roles of Resistance, which is meant to be used as a tool for educators. But I would like to see the interview in three different parts: the past, the present, and the future. But I would like to start from the past, in a way, of your experience, both as an educator, but also in other fields. Because I was really interested. I was reading your bio, and your bio mentions previous jobs that you did. It says that you've worked as a bridge tender, a short order cook, a dishwasher, a construction laborer, a printer, a folk singer, and a first aid attendant. And I think it is not very common for a professor to have all of those in their bio. I think you're the first one that I've seen that lists previous jobs that are not related to academia. So I was interested why that is, why you think it's important to mention such jobs, and if those jobs had an effect in your path as an educator as well.
Thank you, and thanks for having me here today. I do mention the jobs for a couple of reasons. One, most of my students do not come from middle or upper middle class backgrounds. They are the sons and daughters of teachers or of truck drivers or secretaries, which is my experience. I sometimes joke that, I was up at SFU before the place even opened because I was riding with my father in the dump truck that he was hauling fill as they were building the university in the early 1960s. Although I confess I was more interested in the lunch that my mother had packed for us than I was in going to university as a 7-year-old kid. So for me, it's in a way of saying to lots of people, you belong here. You have a right to this place and you should have some access to it. And if I can do it, literally anybody can do it. Right? You don't need to be the son and daughter of a university professor, which is the case of many of my colleagues. Many of my colleagues are the sons and daughters of professionals, of university professors, of doctors and lawyers. So that's one reason. The other reason is that it really did shape me. Coming from a working class family in a working class town, shaped my approaches to university, not always in good ways. It's part of the reason, though, that I thought I would take a gap year after high school that turned into nearly a decade, and then lots of these different jobs here.
Great, thank you very much. I would like to stay in the past and go to your PhD. What did you work on your PhD?
My PhD thesis was a look at labor bureaucracy. So as somebody that had been in the labor movement, had been an activist, been a shop steward, been on negotiating committees, and then watching unions fail to respond to the austerity measures that were being put in place in the 70s and 80s and 90s, trying to figure out why that was. And that had me looking at the role of what we sometimes call the labor bureaucracy. That is to say, people whose career becomes to be head of a union. And they tend to be pretty conservative and pretty mainstream in their politics. They may support the New Democratic Party, which is sometimes called the Social Democratic Party, but it's really just a kind of small L liberal party these days, and that's it. So trying to look at how that evolved was the question that I had as somebody who had been in that movement and had seen what I would call many of its political failures.
You were finishing your PhD during the end of the Cold War. Did that have any effect in how it was perceived and how difficult or easy it was to start working on things that were on labor and on those issues?
Yeah. In a way, it meant that my field of labor history became kind of obsolete, in part because left movements in the West collapsed, in part because without the bogeyman of the Soviet Union, it was easier for governments and politicians and corporations to move further to the right. The one thing about having an allegedly left-wing superpower, they often felt obligated to say, look, we do things better than they do. We are about freedom and justice, and we're going to give workers a little bit of that freedom and justice to make sure that they do not become interested in questions of socialism. So the trend towards certain kinds of postmodernism and post-structuralism meant that academics became less interested in questions of class, which is largely what pushed my own work in this period. And so questions of identity, which are undoubtedly and obviously crucial and important, however, took up all of the space, and class was what got pushed out. Mm-hmm. So that had less effect on my studies, but more effect on thinking about jobs and opportunities in academia, which I have to say was never my first choice for a career. It was something that I kept stumbling into. I would apply for grants and I would say, oh, if I don't get this money, I'm not going to do the MA. And if I don't get this money, I won't do the PhD. And I picked a topic in a PhD that I also thought would have more practical applications. So thinking about becoming a researcher for a trade union, for example, that was more like plan A than becoming a professor.
You mentioned identity and class as separate research things. Mm-hmm. I would think that class is a part of one's identity in a way or another.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. What I believe is happening in the 1980s and 90s is that academics, let me back up a little bit. There was a brief moment when certain kinds of left-wing scholarship were kind of fashionable in the academy. We can just use the broad term to say that, that there was a movement of Marxist intellectuals. Many of them had come from the new left of the 1960s and 70s and had started their own long march through the institutions here. And so scholars inspired by people like E.P. Thompson, like David Montgomery, Sheila Rowbottom, others, Joan Scott, looked particularly at class, at working class movements and alternative movements as part of their studies. By the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, they became less interested in questions about class and more interested in questions about sexuality, about gender, about race. And lots of fabulous work done as a result. But I've always thought it was interesting and important that the first of that so-called trilogy of class, race, and gender that was jettisoned was class. And I can go on at great length about why I think that is, but it's idle speculation on my part. We can come back to it if you're interested.
I think one thing I'm interested in is, we're talking about these trajectories, both for yourself and your career, and also thinking about this broad shift that Ermioni's hitting on. I'm wondering where pedagogy comes into the mix. Mm-hmm. How, for you personally, were you learning to be a leftist? How were you learning to, I'm not going to steal from Paul Willis, but how were you learning to labor?
Yeah.
And simultaneously, what was, on a more mass scale, what was the pedagogical force pushing towards this what you might call, the neoliberal regime that we've been living under for 40 plus years now.
So I can say that I was lucky as a student. SFU was started up in 1965. That meant that as a high school student, I had teachers who had gone through the SFU teaching program that was left in much of its aspect. I mean, it's kind of like saying, who wasn't sort of left in the 60s and 70s? Well, we know, in fact, lots of people weren't. But there was a significant and dramatic shift, that there were lots of people now interested in these questions. I've talked about how it was in history with E.P. Thompson and others, but also in pedagogy. So I had teachers who had come through this program and were determined to do as much as they could to make teaching more student-centered. And that's about saying, what's important are the people in front of me, not the curriculum and not my lesson plan. And that in itself is a pretty liberating way to start thinking about pedagogy. So I was partly shaped by that. I was partly shaped by the political furor. I was too late for the 60s, but some of it carried on and echoed through. I discovered the SDS a couple of years after it had collapsed, for example, but was really interested in the idea of participatory democracy. And as a good sort of, I guess, of those days, liberal high school student, wrote letters to the Minister of Education. And we were, at that point, we had a new government. It was the New Democratic Party, which is a social democratic party. One of its promises was to change education, to really revisit all of it. And they created a commission on education, and they hired a guy named John Bremer, who was a British educator, but had put together something called the Philadelphia School Without Walls in the early 1970s. You may have heard of it. And Bremer at one point did an interview with Stud Sterkel. And he said in his quiet, unassuming way, lots of people will spend a lot of time putting together learning outcomes. But the reality is any idiot can put together learning outcomes. And I must say, many of them do. And the key is to start with the student. And they brought Bremer here. And because I've been writing letters to the Minister of Education, they asked me if I would be a high school representative on this Commission of Education. So without really understanding much of what was going on, I was exposed to lots of this pedagogy. Didn't really stick. I kind of left, went and worked at various jobs for several years before coming back to university with the idea of becoming a teacher. It was a pretty materialist reason for going to university, a careerist one, if you like. But it meant that I could explore ideas and look at things in certain kinds of ways. I ended up never going to the teaching program here. I did an MA in history instead, and then went from bad to worse and became a professor. But I had had some exposure to this, and all of my experiences in the workplace had made me think lots about left-wing politics. But the reality was, when I first started teaching, it was formed more by a couple of things. One was a sense that a lot of working class people came to university with the idea of kind of getting out of the working class and into the middle class, whether that's teachers or social workers or whatever. And so I'm afraid I did see some of my job as helping students get over working class habits, to figure out ways to, if you will, fit into a middle class world, right? So thinking about grammar, maybe don't say ain't. Maybe you could say isn't. Yeah, that's a ridiculous exaggeration, but things like, so I paid some attention to helping people fake their way through these class barriers, right? That someone might look at you really differently depending on your ability to ape some of these behaviors and it's not like I gave etiquette lessons, but I did spend a lot of time on grammar and thinking through things in a particular kind of way. Often regret having done that these days. I don't think anybody ever learned much from my great lecture, Our Friend the Comma, but it was part of it, this notion that we are helping people trying to get out of the working class and avoid being typed by it. It's their class background. The other thing I think that shaped it was that I had politics when I came here and could make use of that. It meant that I did the readings, I had things to say, I was critical, and I was loud enough not to be afraid, and that helped, and tried to pass that on to my students. as well, that it's all right to do this stuff. Let's read this. Let's look at history. But I will say that I gave people exams. I gave midterm exams. I gave the standard final essays, those kinds of things in my first years here, in part because I was aware that I was in a particular kind of institution that had certain kinds of expectations. So I had to unlearn all of that over 30 years of a career teaching.
I wanted actually to ask you if you could talk a little bit more about that, about being a young educator, a young professor, and bringing a political view into education. Was that harder to do in the first years? Did it become easier, or was it always easier for you? Because I would assume that in the beginning there's more uncertainty in keeping a position. So maybe you try to fit in more in what is expected.
Yeah, in fact, it was more insidious than that. I don't think I was aware of trying to fit in, and it just seemed obvious that this is what one did. Because often when you teach, you don't get much training. They say, "Oh, great! We're so happy that you're here, and you're gonna teach this course, and it starts in 3 weeks." And you go, "Wow! Well, what do I do now?" Right? So typically, it's gotten much better now. People get more training, but basically, it was a question of, well, which textbook should I assign? And somebody gave me a tip, and probably many of the listeners have heard this tip, which is you assign students the second best textbook, and you take all of your lectures out of the best textbook. Right? And it was a shock and a delight to discover that most textbooks for one of the courses I was teaching, the big Canadian survey course, had 13 chapters. And there are 13 weeks in the semester. So that laid it out. And so it was formity out of desperation, if you will, not having much sense of how one could do things differently because you're sort of shot out of a cannon and expected to do things in certain kinds of ways. It became obvious to me that with a bit of work and practice, one could do much better than that. And I found that the department I was in was pretty good about it. I had colleagues here, some of whom I had been in classes with because I did my BA and my MA here at Simon Fraser University, which was a weird enough experience in itself, now being a colleague of people that had been teachers of mine. But they were a pretty laid back crew, which was great. And they didn't really much care what one did as long as your grades weren't too out of whack with everybody else. And they were interesting and had done some innovative teaching themselves over. So it was, in that sense, it was a good place to land.
That's going to another question that I have and do you think that you would have been able to teach in the same way in every university? Or do you think that both your teaching and your education and perhaps your view of the world would have been different if you either were at a different university at some point or if you moved to a different university? Or even now, if you go to a different university, do you think that changes the way that you both teach and think?
I think that universities certainly have different cultures, and departments within universities have different cultures. And my sense is that universities have become more conservative over the last 40 years, that the kinds of experimentation and new ideas have been not shut down, but discouraged, and not openly. So the president of a university is not going to say, one hopes, look, this pedagogy of empowering students, all fine and well, but you have to give them a final exam. And it has to be a multiple choice exam. They're unlikely to do that. What they are likely to do is to say, right, you've got a seminar now of 18 students. We need more bums in seats, so we're increasing your class size to 25. And that changes the kinds of things that you can do because it changes the work and the workload that you can do. So I teach a history class with 100 students in it, and I have TAs, and I've been lucky to have you as a particularly great TA. You and Azo and others that I've worked with have all been fabulous. If they said, great, you can have TAs, but now they have to mark 100 students, we have to do things really differently. And that looks more like Scantron exams just to get through it all. It means that there are just the things you simply cannot do. So that's one of the ways to put the screws on. The other thing that they do is they shift funding. It's related to the first part. So STEM gets more money, for example. Economics, which in most universities is pretty right-wing and pretty authoritarian, not in all places, but if you're lucky, they have one or two Marx adjacent professors, but most of them pretty authoritarian. There have been surveys that show that students who do first-year economics classes come out more selfish than when they went in. And that's not an accident. They have huge numbers and they tend to get way more money and more positions than other departments. So that shifts the balance and shifts the weight. And students become accultured to that. They become used to doing the exam, doing the simple essays, that sort of thing, which means that it's really difficult to say, well, we want you to tell us what you think. And I've had so many students come to me and say, you know, I'm a fourth year student now, and this is the first time a prof has ever asked me, what do I think about something? And that to me seems tragic and pathetic, and also a great tool for replicating and maintaining the system. That is a system of hierarchy and authority and capitalism.
You mentioned that you think that universities are becoming more conservative. Is that due to economics, you would say?
It is due to economic pressures put on them. I mean, look, the universities have never been an isolated ivory tower. They have always reflected the reality of the society they're in. And, you know, there's an expression that modern universities do not have a history. Their history is the history of capitalism. And it's always lagging behind, but it's not a surprise that universities look more and more like neoliberal, that is to say, capitalist institutions than they did 40 or 50 years ago. And again, the end of the Cold War meant that money for the arts wasn't so necessary because we don't have to think about freedom anymore. We don't have to think about a challenge to painting the Soviet Union as this monolithic bureaucratic monster while the West is free and liberating. We can just grind people out. And we create the people we want to become happy consumers and cheerful cannon fodder and willing workers. And they've been doing more and more of that, sometimes directly, but often, as I've said, by shifting priorities, by shifting funding to make it more and more difficult to say, right, so here we are as a class. What do you think? What do you want to learn? Because the easiest way to teach, I think, is to grind people through the course that you've set up. You will do this on this day and all of your assignments, everything. Now, having said that, I don't sit here as a great model of a narco teaching, or anarchist pedagogy. I am in a system. I maneuver within it. I'm not plowing much new ground, I'm afraid, but one does what one can.
I'm very surprised that after the Cold War and after the fall of the Soviet Union, things became more conservative. I would expect the opposite in a way, because there's not that much of a fight between the two sides, if we can see that there are two sides.
Yeah. I think I understand why people would think that, and of course, at the time, they even promised us a big peace dividend. Right? That we don't have to put all this money into the war machinery, but of course we continue to. Right? The problem with capital, well, there are many problems with capitalism, but one of them is that it's driven to constantly expand. Right? And enough is never enough. So it's always looking for new markets, for new resources, for new people to exploit both as a labor force and as consumers. So the drive is constant. With the Soviet Union, you at least had some places where capitalism could not penetrate. So it had to tone down just that naked aggression, quite literally, because there was a superpower with nuclear weapons that said this far and no further. This is not a defense of Stalinism or anything like that, but it's really about Cold War realpolitik. It didn't stop capital from kind of weaving in and around and getting in proxy fights around the globe. But the Soviet Union had essentially won the Second World War. It had a certain amount of respect in the West for having gone through the war and through the previous depression as an example of a different way to do things. And capital was really keen to say, no. Whatever you might think about that beguiling picture, it's wrong. So you hear lots about the gulags, as we should. Terrible, no question about that. You hear lots about Joseph Stalin and Stalinism, yep. But it also meant that money went into things like liberal arts to say, look, we actually really believe this. You should read interesting stuff. People who are going to be scientists need some kind of liberal arts. We should be debating. That's why we're different from these people. So it was part of a calculated and very sophisticated strategy to divert people from thinking about class and about politics and about leftism.
I went to go to one of the classes that you're teaching, which is Capitalism and the Making of the Modern World. And we spoke a little bit about it, but I was wondering if you could elaborate more on how education and capitalism connect.
Yeah, well, this course is an interesting example of that because one of the chairs of the history department said, our enrollments are shrinking, as history departments everywhere are shrinking. We need a class that will get people excited. What seems to be a big thing right now is the history of capitalism. So let's do that class. So this was thought up as a money-making idea, right? And we said, look, we can team teach it, and that'll be great. And they asked me if I would do it, and I said, no, thanks. Just not interested in this. Then they asked me again, and finally I said, okay, fine. I did that. And four of us put together a class, and it was very much a kind of mercenary effort. It was pitched as, look, there's 13 weeks in the semester. If we each pull out 3 lectures that we have on our different subjects that are roughly able to be fit into a class like this, we're done. Sounds like all right. Sounds like fun, and for various reasons, I've been teaching the class by myself the last couple of times, and have taken it and shifted it because not everyone in our first class was first committed to doing the kind of teaching and marking that I had thought would be and still believe is useful and interesting, and that you've been participating in, and we're not that actually interested in teaching a kind of course that would examine capitalism really critically. And the blunt fact is that the so-called new history of business and history of capitalism, and their journals with these new titles, are really just a return, in my view, to just an old business as usual, literally, way of looking at capitalism and business, that they are not critical investigations at all.
Would you like to talk a little bit more about your assignments? What do you think is a assignment that is helpful for education and for the students?
Anything that I would say about my teaching, again, has to be prefaced with the comment that I do not hold myself up as an exemplar of anarchist teaching. A.S. Neal and Summerhill would probably be appalled at how authoritarian my assignments actually are when you get right down to it. But I have tried to start by asking students, okay, look, we have a course here. I'm afraid that we didn't get to do this in a democratic fashion. Right? I was told 6 months ago that I'd be teaching this course long before any of you signed up for it, even knew it existed. And any kind of democratic teaching, we'd have sat down long before we met formally to discuss what we wanted to learn, how we wanted to do it. We don't have that opportunity. We are fitting in this weird structure. That puts real limits on what we can do. Having said that, I prepared a course when the basic thing I want you to think about each week is, so what did you notice? What did you notice from the lectures, from the readings? Did anything spark some curiosity? Did something make you go, wow, that really resonates with my experience? Or, oh, this guy is so full of crap, and I'm just going to write 20 pages on why this professor is wrong. What did you notice? So I've tried to build that in and tried to find then ways to capture that sense of asking students, what do you think? What's your reaction to this? And I have to say, I have been really excited and pleased with the work that I've seen students do. And the first time we ran the capitalism class, there were 4 of us team teaching it, and none of us had really had much experience with trying to do assignments like this, but we stuck it out. We put things together. Sometimes it's called portfolio learning. There's lots of different names for getting people to respond to stuff each week in some form or another. But what we all discovered was that our grades went up considerably. And some of us in the group, well, I say some of us, but I wasn't one of them, I will admit, were really worried by that. Like, this is going to throw off the grade point average. It's going to throw off our curve, and we're not going to, because people are doing really good work. And I thought, that's great, isn't it? Isn't that fabulous? Isn't it great that more people are getting more excited? And people came around to that view, and we've tried to keep that as part of how we think about this course, rather than saying, you know what, you just didn't get it. For whatever reason, you didn't spit it back when we said spit it out on this day in this room. Maybe you were sick. Maybe you just don't care, but you didn't get it, so you get a C-. When we found that students were asked what they thought when we did that work, they responded. The writing was better. Because when people sit down to write a formal exam answer or write a paper, you can see they stiffen up and they look at the screen and their brains they're sweating and they start to think, in this paper, I shall attempt to elucidate the following concepts, rather than going, you know what really pissed me off this week? This is what pissed me off, and it sounds like this, and I thought this was really exciting and interesting, and yada yada yada. So you free them up, and that to me just seems to be such an important thing to do and such an exciting thing to see as an instructor in this class. Now, when you let people respond and think about things on their own, they do great, because we tend to think our students don't know anything, or that they are somehow resisting our attempt to pound sand into their heads and call it education. They're thinking, of course, like all people, they're thinking all the time. They're reacting, they're responding, they're weighing things that they hear and read against their own experience and their own lives, trying to make sense of it all. And it's exciting to watch. And the response from students has been mostly very positive.
Just out of my own curiosity, I'd love to go into the class. What is your pedagogy? I've heard from Ermioni that there may be musical instruments involved. What are when you say this is fucking awful, I love this, who are you talking about? Who are people reading? How are they? If it's 100 people, is it small group conversation based? What does a day in your classroom look like as you study the history of capitalism?
Okay. So one of the things that's made us different from lots of universities, and gave people, even people who are pretty conservative in their outlook, some taste or sometimes just some real pressure to teach in slightly more democratic ways, is that the building was literally designed to have large lecture halls, 300 people, and then breakout groups, that is to say, tutorials of 20 students or so led by TAs. It's literally built into the architecture, and it's the only thing that saved us from having massive classes without tutorials and discussion groups. And that reflected the time when it was built. It reflected the architect and this vision of new kinds of teaching and thinking from the 1960s. Lots of what I try to do is to do things that I hope will generate discussions in the tutorials, to get people, so what did you think? What did you read here? And I tend to give people this is a first year class, I tend to give them fewer academic pieces to read. I have done that in the past. I would go through the journals, and this is a great thing on the meaning of Confederation and language that sounds like their papers. In this essay, I shall attempt to elucidate, oh God. So journalism, popular articles by people that are good, smart, and critical, but are much more accessible. Right? And when you think that I have a first year class, which means that I have a lot of students who are literally one summer out of high school, right? That's a good thing to think about. How do I push them but still make it accessible? I don't ask them to think, to try to find the thesis statement. Right? What is the argument? But ask them, again, just what did you notice? You read this piece. What did it make you think of? What triggers it? What's your reaction to what you've read here? What can you pull out of it? Give them more detailed prompts to help them with things. But so that's how I structure the readings and the tutorials. In the lectures, I do try to grab people's attention. So that's a friend of mine said, first year teaching is mostly shouting and waving your arms around. And there's some truth to that. I've tried to, but so I give use a lot of pictures. I'm not very adept at using images, as Ermioni can attest. I just got to cut and paste it, but don't put a lot of text up on PowerPoint. And I tell people, okay, look, this is my argument. Now this is a story that I think makes the argument. So, and I try to pick up things that will resonate with their life outside of school. Now, when I first started teaching, and there were maybe 4 or 5 television stations, and most of them played reruns. And so you could count on your class having a big kind of cultural, reservoir, right? That, you may have heard of a show called The Brady Bunch, a sitcom from the early 70s. Well, there was a time when I could get most people in the class to sing that theme song. right? And that would let us spin out to talk about monopoly capitalism, to talk about, what does this mean to look at this so-called picture-perfect family? What are the assumptions? What does this tell us about race and sexuality and gender, etc. In here? But of course, that's gone. Right? The idea of shared, even humor and shows the culture has changed so drastically, and the fact that the university is much more diverse. We have an awful lot of students who did not grow up with televisions, let alone the same terrible sitcoms that poisoned our minds. So you have to look deeper and look for different kinds of things too. But most of our students here work, so focusing on their work experience helps them make these kinds of connections. Go, oh, so that's why my boss does that. I thought that he was just a jerk. Well, he may just be a jerk, but there are certain rules and logics that bosses have to follow if they want to be successful. So as much as I can, I try to figure out things that will resonate with students. And it is true that I play the banjo in class. It's loud, so it wakes up people in the nosebleed section in the 300-person lecture hall. But it also gives them a moment to breathe. And if they sing, they literally now have to breathe. And I try to get them to sing along here. It's mostly kind of, folk music of certain kinds, old labor songs and the like, which means that the tunes are pretty easy for people to learn. And they usually have choruses that people can come in on. So, and that it's a way to actually get people to actively participate in the lecture. So it also, as I said, gives them a breath, makes them take a breath. Many of the songs are just kind of good. They get people engaged. They tell a story, and you move from there. So it is one of the things that I do. A former student of mine, John Henry Harder, put together a collection of role plays that we do, sometimes in the lecture, sometimes in the tutorial. So again, students now have a shared experience that they can talk and write about in the class. And these are focused on the topics, history of capitalism. We look at a bunch of different things and use them to kind of explore myths and then connect to their own work. So I do a lot of yelling and waving my arms, right?
And singing Joe Hill songs, it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. Indeed.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. One of my favorites is a song by a woman named Sarah Ogan Gunning, who was active in the 1930s, the coal mining strikes. And I actually I saw her perform once, and she said, a lot of people said I was a communist. And I want you all to know that I've never been a communist, and I do not know why people said I was a communist. Now, I wrote this little song, and she goes into this tune that starts off, I hate the capitalist system. I'll tell you, I think I know why, Sarah. I think I've got a clue here as to why they might have been suspicious. Right? So there are great songs and great material. I mean, there's all kinds of, one of my colleagues does great stuff from the Renaissance and uses music. And, it's just one of the tools that we can use. But mine does have a political focus that I find students, by and large, tend to respond to, because one of the things that we see, and this has grown increasingly over the last 30 odd years that I've been teaching, is that while students may have come from different backgrounds and kind of wanted to get into the middle class, as I said earlier, that's really changed. And students who come from what we used to think of as the middle class, in fact, are often working to help out the family. They've got all kinds of family responsibilities. The welfare systems do not take care of in the way that they did for some people 40 years ago. It's harder and tougher, I think, for people now than it was 30 or 40 years ago. So the idea of things about class, about resistance, I think have a more natural audience, although one that has little experience, because the kinds of institutions that used to put out those kinds of messages, whether it's unions or community groups, even churches, have lost the ability or the interest in putting forward these kinds of messages about class and resistance.
For 1 week of your class, you have the students read poems and songs, which I thought it was very interesting material. Because it's a history class, one wouldn't necessarily expect that. Do you think people also respond well to that as reading, not just and something that performed in class, but also having to read that kind of material instead of something with more structure, I guess.
I have not read all of the comments that students made on the readings. It is one of the things that I ask them to do, is to comment, take 10 minutes. What did you learn from this lecture? What did you learn from the tutorial? What did you think? What did you notice? And here, I haven't read them all yet, but people seemed generally to appreciate it. There's a reason that humans write poetry and write and perform music. It speaks to something in us. And if it also has a political lesson attached, so much the better, in my view. So certainly my experience in other classes have been that students do respond to it, that it's a way of, like lots of art, of giving voice, giving expression to emotions and ideas that we don't often get a chance to experience and express.
You mentioned that with a colleague of yours, you've been using games, I guess I can call it, or non-formal education elements in your classes to help the students learn. And you wrote a book, I think, based on that, called Roles of Resistance. Would you like to talk more about that?
Yeah, both John Henry Harder, the co-author, and I have used games. We were partly inspired by some of the work done in the labor movement to do this, and a book called The Power in Our Hands that came out, must be 30 years ago now, that did a similar kind of thing. And we've taken more modern examples and use things that speak to our own experiences as teachers and as workers in Canada. But again, the emphasis is always if students are doing something, they're sharing an experience that they can build on, that's better than them just listening to us for all of our yelling and banjo playing and waving of arms here. And it lets them speak to each other. Because as I've suggested, as universities, and rightfully so, have become much more diverse in terms of the student population, the kinds of connections and experiences that bind people together, that help them share ideas, that make them comfortable with each other, are not quite there. So we have to work harder to do that. And so a common expression, we're going to do this game. What did you think? Well, whatever your background, whatever your ideas, you have now an experience that in common with everybody else. And so it is just the game itself that's important as much as any particular lessons that we might want them to get from the game. But we do have lessons attached. The games are not politically neutral. They are there to say, look, this is a way of showing, for example, how something like Taylorism and speed ups on the job work. And you've read something about this, you've heard a lecture about this, now you've done a game that shows how this works. It's kind of a fun, goofy game, but people make paper airplanes first as artisans, very carefully making the plane, and then we put them on assembly lines where they all make one single fold and pass it on and try to do it as quickly as possible. And we show, sometimes the first 15 minutes of the Charlie Chaplin film, Modern Times, as well. And then students will say, look, this is like my job. When I started at Starbucks, they told me I was going to be a barista and I would be handcrafting drinks. In fact, I push a button now, and it's all about producing as much coffee as possible. It's like, oh, why is that? And then students are smart, they get it, they pull it together because, like everybody, they have their own experience as workers, as consumers of both products and education, and their own sense of what this could and should be. And those don't always align. So if you're told, for example, that getting a job means you're going to be an interesting and productive member of society, and your job is shit, what do you do with that? You've got this whole set of expectations. Well, you tend to blame yourself. I must be a failure here. And that's a great lesson for people to learn if you're the boss. Yep, it is your fault. That's why you're not a millionaire. That's why you should get back on the assembly line and back making coffees and just shut up. At the same time, we're told this is a democracy and it's about freedom and about liberation, and they are completely befuddled by this purposeful cognitive dissonance. So helping people say, yeah, you know what? Your reaction to the boss, to work, the so-called logic of capitalism, your genuine sense of fairness, of equality, those are important. And you're right to object to how this is being pounded out of you.
What do you think resistance looks like in academia, in a university?
Wow. Well, I guess the first thing I would say is, as a teacher in an authoritarian environment, is that subaltern resistance is a lot more fun to study than it is to deal with. That is to say, certain kinds of resistance from students, it's like, I'm trying so hard. It's like, I don't care. You're just another, authoritarian, and I'm just, but I think that part of it that gets difficult is that students have been increasingly subjected to teaching from K to through university, K to 12 and university, that has become more authoritarian, more hierarchical, both explicitly. So school boards will say this will be the new curriculum. And we're not going to talk about these subjects. We're going to censor books. This is happening all over the place. And then, as I said earlier, in a more subtle fashion by saying, we're just going to increase your numbers. You can teach any way you want. If you want to mark 500 term papers, you can give them term papers. Or you can do the Scantron exam. It's up to you. Right? Of course, COVID didn't help, and COVID also made the kind of social education and more advanced pedagogical ideas and techniques harder to do. The teachers were scrambling just to try to keep the class, and sometimes literally just keep the class from dying on them. So students have not had as much experience. And we also have teachers now who have gone through 40 years. I call neoliberalism. It just kind of seems like old capitalism to me, but we can save that for another time. Who themselves were brought up in a more authoritarian structure and have not thought to challenge it. They went to schools where they were expected to sit up straight, and some of them loved it. They loved it so much that they decided to become university professors, and so they've spent their entire lives since they were 5 years old in a state institution, and they're okay with that, right? So that has put dampers on it, and dampers. So some of the most conservative people I see are new professors who are really, they're great, they're smart, they're brilliant, they work super hard. But their first response to teaching is to teach the way that they were taught, which has been increasingly authoritarian and hierarchical. I've completely forgotten your question here. I'm sorry.
No, not at all. So do you think it's important for professors to change education? Or because one can say it's just a job, it's just another job for me.
Yeah.
So I just want to go there, do the job in the easiest way possible, and then leave and go home. But do you think there's more to that?
Yeah. I have to say, in the department that I have been in, I've not seen many people that say the teaching is just a job. I'm just going to do it as little as I possibly can and go home and get out of it. Right? I understand that it's common in some places for people to have that reaction. But now that doesn't mean that they are all politically and pedagogically on the same page. So I have colleagues who who spend tons of time with students. They work really hard to help them master our friend the comma or whatever they really concentrate on. And I don't blame them. I've done that myself. And it's a process, and it reflects who we are and what we think is most important here. But I think that the university more and more rewards people who take what I'm calling more authoritarian and hierarchical approaches to teaching. It's the best way to produce more units more cheaply. So in that sense, if the university treats students both as customers, right? Come here, buy our stuff, it's great. They're also the product that universities turn out, and they want to turn out more product more cheaply, more quickly. Like the paper airplane game, put them on the assembly line and do that. And without a broader culture to support different kinds of pedagogy, people, do kind of want to fit in. Right? Most people don't want to really make big waves. They don't want to say, I'm going to give everybody A's on my class. And I think I can defend that pedagogically. They kind of want to fit in and do this stuff, and I understand that. But it is, I think, the result of an education system that from its very beginning, more than 150 years ago, was not set up to empower people, but to train them for certain roles in a capitalist society, in a capitalist economy.
So would you say that education is becoming more of a commodity, or Are you think that it was always that way, just in different forms?
Yeah, I think it's always, in part, been a commodity in one, but also people saw it as an investment. As someone that started off doing labor history, I used to remark, and still do remark ruefully, that I decided to study the working class to avoid staying part of it. And it's not the worst thing that people do, right? I mean, that's people have lives, you have expectations, you have talents, you have interests, whatever. The fact that not everyone gets the same kinds of opportunities, that's a huge issue and a problem here. But I think that more and more universities are selling the dream of education as the university education as the only thing that you can do to have a good life. And the reality is, like, having a so-called good job is increasingly difficult. Right? You might get a job that pays a little better than average, but that's all being devalued. Jobs are losing their autonomy. One of the reasons people became teachers and librarians and professors was the idea that you had a great deal of autonomy over your job, and that's changing drastically. Right? As universities treat students as consumers and as products, as I've said a few times, I guess the pressure is to crank up that assembly line, to put more bums in seats, to increase revenues. A quick story. Lots of universities have a calculation that they do. They talk about full-time equivalencies with their students. It's a way of calculating. So quickly, if you have 2 half-time students, that amounts to 1 full-time equivalent, right? So FTEs, they're called. It's just a kind of an accounting thing in terms of students and numbers and tuition. At one university in Canada, they don't call them FTEs, they call them BIUs, which stands for Basic Income Unit, which is a pretty, you have to admire, I guess, the honesty, but a pretty brazen and pretty despicable way to think about education.
So, what more can we do as students, as educators? How can we, I guess, resist in a way against
Yeah.
becoming products and buying into products?
Yeah. I do think that lots of people who come to university do want to resist that. They don't always know that they want to resist it, but they come and when they get challenged, when they are interested, when they get to do things, they get to express themselves, which again is increasingly rare at universities. They love it. So the more we can do to actually change that focus from our syllabus, from our learning outcomes to the students in front of us, the better. And we can't do it all in one fell swoop. People do whatever they can. You try to break people into small groups. You play the banjo. You get them to do role plays. You get different kinds of. You get away from standardized testing and the 5-paragraph essay into exercises that let them answer that question. What did you notice? What do you feel? What do you think? And this is. In itself, I think, a project of liberation, regardless of the content. Now, people often will say, well, it's very easy. You're in the arts, and arts are all about just, talking about stuff and talking about your feelings. But I teach math and I teach biology. But some of the most exciting pedagogy that I've seen has been from mathematicians and from biologists who also understand that making the teaching student-centered in itself has huge possibilities for liberation, for opening up, respecting, I think, people's own integrity, the fact that they come to us with ideas. And some of those ideas are awful, right? I mean, I don't know that I've had a confessed full-blown Nazi in my class. If I did, they were quiet enough, but I've had some that were kind of close. But that becomes a challenge to surmount, not something to shut down. And that's also true of students who are, on the right of the spectrum without being Nazis or, wherever they are, but to help them think through some of these things and do so in dialogue with other students as ways to push them and to push all of us to think and to rethink and to concentrate on, I think, one of the most important things that we can try to encourage people, which is to think hard about ethics and values in politics. And when we do that, I'm always, I wouldn't say surprised, because I had a deep suspicion that this would be the case, but delighted to find out that most people actually want to be good, decent human beings, right? That they understand that we are all in this together. And that we do not have to be pitted against each other, whether this is on grounds of sexuality, of gender, of race, or class, that we can do better.
You described a democratic pedagogical method as building a class together with the students, rather than building the class as a professor and then the students just come to the class. Do you think that would be possible in a university setting, at least? Perhaps in smaller groups or seminars? Or do you think that the way that the university is formed nowadays, that's not something that's even possible?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's possible, again, to do bits of this, right? And some people might be able to do bigger bits than others for different kinds of reasons. But every professor can say, you know, I'm not going to give them a midterm exam with multiple choice answers. I'm going to find a different assignment. You know, they might not want to move to ungrading or something like that, but there are always things that people can do. And it does get more difficult when we are told to process more units and to do so more quickly and efficiently. And that's then about fighting collectively, right, as professors, for the kind of academic freedom to teach as we think is best and is necessary.
Thanks so much for listening. Today's episode was produced by Ermioni. If you like our podcast, please like, rate, follow, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also find us on Instagram, where Another Ed is possible. We'll be back soon with a new episode of Another Education is Possible.